We watched a lot of sports in my house when I was a kid, and some of them, because I played them, I understood more deeply than others. The one we would watch was car racing, and Indy cars, you kind of got that they just went fast. NASCAR, I didn't really fully understand until when I was in high school, a movie came out, Days of Thunder. Tom Cruise plays Cole Trickle, a young hotshot race car driver who can drive a car faster than anybody, but he's never raced at the top level, and so they pair him up with a character named Harry, played by Robert Duvall, who's this old crew chief who knows everything about racing, and his job is to take this young car racer and teach him how to really race the car. So early in the movie, they do their time trials, right? And this is how a NASCAR race starts. They all drive around as fast as they can, and then they line them up in their spaces to start the race based on how fast they went, and then the race is on. Well, in one of the first races, one of the crafty veterans, you see him talking on his headphones to his crew chief, says, "I'm going to give the rookie a little introduction." So he pulls up behind him in the middle of the race and just bumps the back of his car. At which point, Cole Trickle pulls his car out of the line of cars that are humming around the outside of the track, and he pulls down in the middle. And Harry in the headphone says, "What are you doing?" He says, "That guy just slammed into me." And he says, "He did not slam into you. He did not bump you. He did not nudge you. He rubbed you, and rubbing, son, is racing." And that is where I learned that if you pay closer attention to a NASCAR race, there's a whole lot of rubbing and racing, right? They hammer into each other. They drive each other into walls. And the better at it they get, they crash less. They still crash plenty. What happens in the movie then is this montage of his early races where he just keeps crashing everywhere because they keep bumping into him and he hasn't figured out how to drive with all of that yet. It's a surprise to him as he comes along that as he's trying to fight for his space up front, that there's a little challenge that goes along with that. Today we hear a parable from Jesus. Parables are meant to have surprises in them. Jesus tells these stories because if you just accuse people of things or tell them what's wrong with them, we get very defensive. Parables come at us at an angle so we can listen to the story, and then maybe we are a little more thoughtful and open to change. Now, he's going to the house of a Pharisee for the Sabbath meal, and I always love that because they always accuse Jesus of eating with sinners and tax collectors, but he's also eating with them, right? So they kind of miss the fact that they're amongst the sinners that Jesus eats with. But when he gets there, he sees them trying to figure out who's sitting where, right? Because there's a seat of honor at this banquet, and I don't know how that looked to him. But then he tells them a parable. And lots of the parables read like things that have already happened, right? Like Jesus says, there was a man, he got beat up and left in a ditch. Or there was a person that lost a coin. In this case, it's more of an imaginary parable. Like, imagine you get invited to a wedding banquet, and then you take the best seat, and then the host has to come and tell you to move down. And whenever I hear this, I imagine the setting, right? Like this person comes in and sits down, and everybody else goes, who does he think he is sitting in that seat? And then I picture the host like greeting people at the door, and then turn around and going, now I got to go deal with this. I got to go tell this person to move, and that's good. And then everybody else is like, boy, this is awkward. Like the whole party gets off to a rough start. So Jesus says instead, take the lowest seat, and you can get moved up. Now the hard part sometimes with parables as I come at that is I say, okay, well, as Jesus told this story, what would have been surprising to them? In the parable of the Good Samaritan, it's surprising that the Samaritan, who would have been the hated neighbor, is the one who stops and helps, right? So then that makes them have to think. And so when I read this story, I'm not sure what the surprise would have been. But in their culture in Jesus' time, honor was a big deal. And you competed with one another for honor, much like race car drivers compete to see who can get around the track the fastest. And my honor could go up if you get dishonored. And as you hear the parable, right, if you aim too high and you think you're more honored than you are, then you get disgraced and your honor goes down as you have to move down those seats. And so coming into that party, they no doubt would have been competing for honor. So then as you hear the parable and as they heard the parable, they say, well, they were choosing the seats of honor. They maybe hear, yeah, that's what we do. And then Jesus says, instead, you should intentionally take the lowest seat. And I wonder if that was the surprise. If they went, whoa, wait a minute. We want to grow in honor. Why would I let go of my honor and go take a lower seat? And so I suspect that may be what the surprise would have been for them. But we don't live in a culture that has honor tied into what we do in the same kind of ways. And so I have wondered if the surprise ends up being a little bit different from us. I thought this week about my first 6-8 months in the business world. I was assigned to a testing team that was testing software for a company that was launching a new business unit. And there were these rows of tables in this little tiny conference room, and there was like 30 of us packed in there every day just testing software. We were making sure they could bill their customers correctly, making sure if you called the help desk to get help, that the software that they used worked. And when we finally got it done and launched the company, then they needed a help desk. So they took almost our entire team who knew how to use all the software and moved them over to the help desk, and they left 2 of us. Well, we were now 6 months, he and I, into our illustrious business careers, and so they put us in charge of the test lab because we had been in the midst of all that testing. But we were consultants, and everybody knew we weren't going to be around for very long, so they hired new people to be the permanent team. Well, those new people came in, and they said, those 2 guys used to be on the team, and now they run the team. But they're not going to be there for very long, so who's going to run the team next? And who do you suppose they thought that was going to be? Me, right? One of them. So they started to kind of compete, and they tried to work hard. Now, this is the thing. In the parable, you're either choosing the top seat or you're choosing a lower seat. And this is why I don't find that bit surprising, because the best way to maybe get that job is to just put your head down, work hard, be humble, and let your performance speak for itself, right? Instead of trying to lobby for this thing. The big surprise for them was 2 women had actually already been hired that had a whole ton of experience to run that team. They just hadn't shown up yet, and when they got there, the shock for everybody who was trying to maneuver for this wanted seat, right? They were like, ooh. But this is the thing, I don't think it's surprising to us that A, we might try to compete for seats of honor, but B, that we might find that some humility lands us in a good space. So then I have to come back to this parable and say, maybe 2,000 years later, the surprise for us is a little bit different than it might have been for them. Maybe we hear the parable different. And so I found myself asking this week, what about this story is surprising to me? And what I landed on was a surprise to me, which is, I'm not sure, like in the story, they're trying to work out who's sitting where. I think most of the time, we know just where our place is. Like I go to weddings, right? And if I go to a wedding, there's usually a big long table with a bunch of round tables. Who sits at the big long table? The bride and groom, and who else? The wedding party. Am I supposed to go sit at that table? No, and I know that. In fact, most of the time when I go to a wedding, there's a table outside the reception that has little cards that tell me exactly where to sit, right? So I know where I'm sitting. Likewise, I think about most of the places I've been in my life, I know my place. When I was a consultant, think about offices you may have been in. Whose office is on the top floor? Executive, CEO. Who get the corner offices in the mid floors that have windows? Managers. Who gets the cubicle with a post in the middle of it and a printer and like barely enough room to sit? Peter earlier said that's my cube. That was the cube I had. That's the cube consultants get, right? So I knew my place. I knew I wasn't an employee. I knew I didn't fit in that place other than that someone was traveling through. And if you think about the places that you spend your life in, my guess is most of the time you know your place. We talked about this Wednesday night during our Wednesday Wonder Worship, and I asked the same question, like, do we know our place? And one person had worked in a manufacturing facility. Did you know your place? He said, yes, of course. And he said, I cross the line sometimes. And I said, did you know you were across the line? Yes. right? So you know your place. That doesn't mean you like to stay in it. It'd be like if in a NASCAR race, all the cars just lined up and then just drove around in circles without trying to pass each other, right? Because you know your place and you stay in your place. Now, I would bet that most of you women that have worked in the business world or wherever, probably at some point in time, got told what your place was. I'm guessing, right? People of color in this country know what their place is. And the reason you find out we know these things is because when we try to cross those boundaries, we very quickly get told where those boundaries are to be reminded of where our place is. When I was, just before I left for seminary, my home church was negotiating with the St. Louis airport to buy our property for an airport expansion, and that negotiation was not going well. We had to request to get condemned. We had to go to court to do that, and then we got put into mediation, and I got to go to that because I was on the church council. And we walked into the room, and I thought, well, mediation should probably be a give and take and be some kind of effort on both sides. So the pastor sat on this side of the table, and I sat on the other side of the table. And when the lawyers came in, what did they tell me to do? Move. This is an adversarial process. We don't sit on the same sides of the table. I was reminded where my place was. So when I come to this story, in this day, in a culture that for all of our talk of merit and you can do anything you want, we're very hierarchical and we often know what our places are. And if you've never thought about that and you're like, well, I've never struggled with understanding where my place is, maybe that's because you have a good place and you haven't pushed any boundaries, right? But when we come to this story, then what's the surprise? If it's not surprising that we sometimes compete and it's not surprising that maybe we know that being humble is sometimes helpful, maybe the surprise is that we might not know our place. But what actually surprises me in this story is that as Jesus tells the story, there are always, in this little bit of the parable, there's enough seats. The person that tries to take too much honor doesn't get kicked out of the party. They just get moved to a different seat. There's food enough for everyone and place enough for everyone. And I wonder if that's not actually part of what Jesus was getting at. Because when he finishes the parable, he looks at his host and says, when you throw a party, don't invite all the people, your family, the rich people, the people that are your friends, who can invite you back. Which is Jesus saying, don't invite the people who have their own spaces and seats, just like you have your own space and seats. Instead, he says, invite the people who are poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. He's telling his host, don't invite people who already have a place. Invite the people that don't. And so maybe the surprising thing for us in this parable, those of us who know our place, is that there are more places than we can imagine, and then Jesus defines space differently than we do. This is why it matters so much to me that we gather around this table every week, because we say, who is invited to this table? Does this table ever run out of space? Nope. I think some of the most profound experiences of grace that we have within the church, not necessarily out in the world, is when we realize that there is room for us at this table always and that there's nothing we have to do to earn that. So we gather around a table that always has space, always have enough to eat, and that everybody is welcome to. And in this space, that can very much be an experience of grace, but it's also practice, so that when we go out into the world, instead of just settling into the spaces that we know are ours, instead of minding the boundaries of other people who cross lines and try to find different space for themselves, instead of assuming that there are scarce things in the world like chairs and resources and all of the rest of the things we fight over, when we gather around this table and find out that God has room enough for everyone, then maybe we go out into the world and carry some of that with us and cross some of those boundaries and step out of the spaces that we've been assigned to, but more so then, having been welcomed into God's grace, to invite others into that space as well so that they too can know God's love and know that there's space for them just as there is for us. Amen.